Thank you, Bruce, and good morning, everyone. I am Trudy Coxe, your host for Inside the Newport Mansions with our guest author, Annie Reed. Annie is a writer. She is a historian, and she has committed herself to studying and elucidating all of us on women committed to crimes. So we're going to talk about crimes today on this radio show. She earned her law degree from the University of Notre Dame and her history degree from the University of Illinois. She has written a book, debut book, in fact, called The Imposter Heiress, Cassie Chadwick, the greatest grifter of the Gilded Age. And it is out now with Diversion Books. She lives with her family near St. Louis, Missouri, and today she joins us, and this is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
Us. So let's start out. Annie, who was Cassie Chadwick?
She was a Gilded Age con artist, and she swindled herself a fortune by posing as Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. She forged his name to a series of documents to back up this story, and she posed as his daughter for quite some time, amassing this fortune out of loans.
So she posed as his illegitimate daughter. And so she would go into a store or go into a party and say, I'm Cassie Chadwick, and oh, by the way, I am the daughter of... How did this work? How did this work? And did he ever learn about her efforts?
He did. And it was much more subtle than that. She married this doctor, right? And so she's able to be a part of high society. Before then, she was actually an ex-con who was recently out of prison.
And can I interrupt for you for a minute? How did she position herself to be able to marry such a distinguished upper class man?
She pretended that she was a widow of another doctor, so that she had been born into money. Her courtship with Leroy Chadwick is a bit of a question mark. What we know is that they met sometime. It was a quick courtship, and it was a bit secret. People were surprised when he brought her around as his new wife. But she was posing as a widow of another doctor so that she had all this money from her other husband.
But did she have any money at all at that point?
No, she didn't. She had just committed this series of frauds in Toledo that she had served prison time for. And some people were speculating that she had money left over from that, but I don't think that's the case. In a lot of her frauds, I think that if she had money left over, she would have paid her debts and avoided jail to begin with. So she was born a farmer's daughter in a big family in rural Canada. She did not come from money, but she really wished that she did.
And she came from Canada and ended up in the Toledo area. How did that happen?
So she moved down to Cleveland when she was in her early 20s. And that was where her sister was living at the time with her husband. And then Cassie actually married a man in Cleveland, a doctor. This was back in 1882. And she was posing as a wealthy woman, a woman of means. And the doctor found out that she was not who she said she was. And that marriage lasted 9 days, and he kicked her out. So then she was on her own. She kind of traveled around peddling these smaller cons and eventually ended up in Toledo and pulled a bigger one. Yeah.
And how long did the marriage to the second man last?
Her marriage to Leroy Chadwick lasted until her death in 1907. It did last for a while. They got married in 1897. It worked out. She pretended to have other marriages between then, but there were none that existed in reality.
And is there any information about the happiness in that marriage? Did he like her? Did he ever discover that she really was a fraud? Did he question her? What was going on between the two of them? The fact that they lasted, it sounds like, if my math is right, close to 10 years.
About 10 years, yeah. I think that it was a bit of everything with Leroy Chadwick. I think she told him there's a lot of haziness because he always claimed he knew nothing about her history, that she fooled him completely, that he didn't know that they were borrowing so much money at all. Um, and some of those things are demonstrably false. He helped her out when she was flailing a little bit. He was signing notes in his own name. He went with her to a couple of banks to solicit loans. Um, and I mean, she told his best friend when they were in the same room that she was Carnegie's daughter. So I think that she convinced him that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter and that she was very rich and she had all this money. And I think he was a dupe who pretended like he had no idea. He really just didn't know anything when he in fact knew that.
And what was his business, out of curiosity? He was a doctor, you said.
Yes, he was a doctor. He had a small
Oh,
practice. And
gosh.
he had family money as well.
So he was a smart man and he just didn't, was she an attractive woman?
She was, I think she was attractive personally.
Mm.
She she was older when she met and married Leroy Chadwick. I mean, she was claiming she was 30 when she was really more like 42, I would say, when they got married. It would have been almost 40 when they got married. Um, so she was pretending to be younger. I think that I think she was just really good at reading people. And I think she knew he was a widower. He was taking care of his invalid mother and his sick sister, and he had a daughter. And I think she could read that he needed some support. He needed someone to arrange his social life as this man of standing. And I think she did like him. I don't think she didn't like him or anything like that. I think she read what he needed and kind of presented herself in that way.
Oh, that is fascinating. So how did you come across her, Cassie Chadwick?
It was about 6 years ago now. I was listening to a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class, and they had a Cassie Chadwick episode. And at the time, I was living in Columbus, Ohio, and I have a lot of my in-laws live in Cleveland. I lived in a Cleveland suburb for a while, so I had been around Cleveland and I'd never heard of her, and I was just so fascinated. Um, and at that time, the only book out about her was it had been written in 1975, and it was more historical fiction than history. Uh, so I just really dug into her story and was excited to be able to write it.
And was there a lot of documentation around about her?
Yes, there were so many newspaper articles from especially from 1904 to 1905. But also, I mean, like when she was just a part of society, in like 1902, 1900, 1898, when she's hosting parties and going to balls, there's mentions of her in the paper. When she got in trouble in Toledo, there's a lot of articles about her. She was just a very notorious figure already in Toledo at that time. So there was just
And
a lot.
her days in Toledo did not catch up to her
They
in the
really,
second marriage. It's pretty amazing because, well, Ohio is well, not a small state, but I guess in those days, cities were far enough apart that maybe you could keep secrets.
right.
I don't know.
It's very funny because I mean, the Cleveland papers were running stuff about her when she got in trouble in Toledo as Madame de Vere. They're running all these articles, and one of them said, "This is a good, this is a good lesson for banks not to just take these notes and without scrutiny." And it's the Cleveland banks that got hit really hard when she was Cassie Chadwick. It just at that time you could kind of just pretend to be somebody else and have it work. It's very surprising. She had a lot of history in Ohio, but was able to reinvent herself completely.
So what was her maiden name when she started out? DeVere, did you say?
So she was born Elizabeth Bigley, and she goes through a whole bunch of names throughout her life. When she's in Toledo, her professional name, she's a clairvoyant and she runs this clairvoyant practice. So
Mhm.
she's Madame Lydia de Vere, but she's also pretending in private that her name is Florida Blythe, and she's also passing herself off as this widow Hoover. She goes through names and personalities.
What was it that fascinated you so much about her? I think I know the answer to this, but I want to hear you. The
She
character.
she was so bold. She just loved taking risks. And I mean, things like going to Carnegie's house and pretending that she was going in there to meet with him. telling people who knew him that she was his illegitimate daughter. She went to his hometown of Pittsburgh and got a lot of money out of people who did business with him. And it was just so bold. I can't even fathom taking that many risks and being that brazen. And it was just so fascinating to read that and put myself in her shoes.
And was she well educated?
I mean, she went to like the rural, like a grade school basically, and she did well in her classes. She was known as being intelligent. But she was very self-taught, and she was able, when she was passing herself as Cassie Chadwick, she was able to fake people into thinking she had had this great education as this woman who came from money, and talk about world affairs and art and literature like she had read these books and seen all this art. It just, like, she could fake it very easily. She was very smart, but she didn't have like this comprehensive education.
Yeah, she. So why do you think swindlers seem to have so much success during the Gilded Age?
Um, I think there were a few things. One thing was what we talked about, the ability to kind of pull up stakes, go to a different place, hop on a train, and be someone else. I mean, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have photographs were something that were like a special occasion. You didn't have just pictures floating around. You didn't have fingerprints, really. I mean, like, I think you had the beginnings of fingerprint technology, but it wasn't a widespread thing. It was easy to reinvent yourself and to disappear. Um, I also think this was a time, economically speaking, of a lot of speculation and this madcap investing. And this is a background that you can get rich quickly, and you can get rich by giving your money to the right person, basically. And she was able to capitalize on that, the spirit of that, I think.
And that was part of, would you guess too that during the Gilded Age, there was so much change? It was such a time of rapid everything, technology and innovation, invention, that I think people could be left to themselves and not noticed, especially if they were planning on doing bad things,
Right.
and probably get away with it because nobody was paying attention.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there was so much growth and so much, I mean, like, especially in a city like Cleveland that's quickly industrializing and has all this vast wealth and these jobs, that people just pouring into Cleveland in the 1880s and 1890s. Just a lot going on.
I'm very interested in understanding how this, farm girl from Canada uh, rises up and ends up in Ohio and ends up being a swindler, a real swindler, a grifter, whatever you want to call her, and makes it good. What do you think was motivating her from her childhood in Canada that would give her the courage and the ambition? Ambition, I guess I can understand, but
Yeah.
you gotta have a lot of guts to live a life like that. What was it about her family or her family life that gave her this chutzpah?
From everything I read, it was a very normal life. It wasn't this family full of people who were breaking the law. They paid their debts. They worked for their money. I didn't find anything there that was like, aha, that's how she learned it. It really is like, it feels like she was, I don't know if I want to say born that way, but this was ingrained. I mean, she started conning people when she was 21, and just pretending to be an heiress. It was a very small version of her later schemes, passing forged notes, pretending that she had all this money in a trust somewhere. Um, and she just kind of kept doing the same thing over and over. I think she just really wanted to be not just rich and have all the things, which she loved. I mean, she loved diamonds, she loved gowns and furs and rugs and all the finery, but she also wanted that backstory that she was from money, and that she was blue-blooded, like she had come from this status. And she kind of wanted to make her life so that she could live that way.
And she started her con artist career in Toledo itself. Is that right?
Her very first con was in Canada, in her hometown area. It was like a neighboring city. Yeah. It was when she was 21, and she had these little business cards printed out that said Miss Bigley, heiress to $18,000. And she would, yes. It- it's wild. She just started telling people that like an uncle had died and left her all this money. And she was also forging these promissory notes with just different local farmers' names and passing these notes. She would get loans from banks based on these notes, and she would use them as part payment for her bills. It just, yeah, it was a very small scale, the same thing she did later, like forged notes and this story about being an heiress.
And so was it at that point in Canada, with her first attempt to pull fast ones on people, did she get caught?
She did.
She
She
did. And that would have been, I think, if she was not far from home, that must have been very embarrassing to her
Oh yeah.
family.
Oh yeah. I know I didn't get a lot of like quotes from her family. They didn't talk to papers, obviously. I think it was very embarrassing. Her trial at the time, like crowds came to that trial. People wanted to watch it. They were very interested. Um, and I know that she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So she had this insanity
Oh,
plea and she got off, but I'm sure that was also very embarrassing. For people to think that she was crazy, and she was sent home with her parents, basically. Uh,
oh my Lord.
yeah.
What a night that first night must have been.
Oh my, yes.
And then did she very quickly leave home, or what happened?
I think it was, oh my goodness, within like a year or two that she left home, and her sister had recently married a man and moved to Cleveland to set up house. And so she moved in with them for a while. She just wanted to be out on her own, I think.
And so while in Cleveland, living with her sister, is she beginning to start all over again with the con jobs?
Yes. She starts, so at this time in Cleveland, well, probably most cities at the time, you have these short-term small money lenders that you can, they advertise in the paper and you write to them and you can just arrange loans for like $50, $100, just small amounts. And so she was using these money lenders. She would invite them to her sister's house and use her sister's furniture as collateral for loans. And she would pretend like she was her sister Alice, and she would say, "Oh, ask the neighbors about me. I have this great reputation. Come inside the house, pick out something, and that will be the collateral for this loan." And eventually her brother-in-law kicked her out of the house because they had money lenders knocking down their door,
Oh my Lord.
asking for money. So she's immediately trying to use this money to buy a wardrobe and kind of set herself up as being more wealthy.
So she is kicked out of her sister and brother-in-law's house in Cleveland and goes off on her own, or is that
Yes.
when she marries this first man, or what?
Yes, yeah, pretty quickly. She gets an apartment of her own, I think, and around this time is when she starts dabbling in clairvoyance. She's, being a medium and, charging money for it and doing pretty well. And then she meets this doctor. And so she's pretending like she's this rich woman and that she is from the same social status as he is.
And her career as a clairvoyant, how did that enter into her life?
I think that it was really good practice. She had such a talent already for reading people and situations very quickly, just walking into a room and being able to tell what buttons to press on people. And as a clairvoyant, you have people coming in off the street and wanting you to tell them things about themselves and about the future. And she could just practice that over and over again of um, picking up on little cues, on body language, eyes, clothes, all these things, and being able to accurately talk to people. And later on, when she was taking meetings with bankers and businessmen and um, trying to figure out how to convince them which buttons to press, I think that came in handy, as well as when she was walking into a ballroom at a big social party and having to fake her way through it and pretend like she's been doing this her whole life. I think that helped her a lot.
And did this career as a clairvoyant, did that progress throughout her life, or was it a certain period between husbands or something?
From what I could tell after Toledo, she didn't go back to it. There are a few years between when she's paroled from prison and she marries Leroy Chadwick that it's possible that she did some more fortune telling. But I think after Toledo, she stopped because
Mhm.
she wanted to marry rich and reinvent herself again.
Does she remind you of any other female grifters or other types of criminals, female criminals of that period?
Oh my goodness. I read a lot about a lot of female grifters from that time period. So there are a lot of them. The
Hmm.
two that come to mind was Bertha Hayman, her alias Big Bertha. She was active in New York City more in the 1880s and 1890s, but she ran a very similar scheme over and over again. She was very successful of pretending that she was rich and she had money, but she needed a loan. And she was just got a lot of different men to loan her money, and then she just would be off and never pay them back.
Wow,
um,
wow.
yeah.
And did
And
she end up in jail herself, Big Bertha?
in and out a couple times. She
Wow.
actually, I believe that she conned a guy in jail, that she was writing to him and got him to give her a bunch of money. And she had this interview to where I forget the exact quote, but she talked about how she took pride in fooling intelligent men and smart men, because she said it helps my intellectual pride, basically, that she just really liked the game and winning basically against these men. Um, and the other woman who I had in mind was Therese Humbert. She was French, so I don't really know how to pronounce her name, but she was active around the same time as Cassie Chadwick was. She was someone else who was from just a working class family, and she started telling people this interesting story about how she had met some rich American on the road and he had been hurt, and she helped him. She helped heal him or helped nurse him to health or something like that. He had left her this fortune and he died, and so she borrowed a ton of money, and it was all just a story, and she got caught. And but it was a similar thing to where it was years of borrowing a lot of money.
Did any of these women know each other?
I don't think so. I would love for that to be the case, a network of grifting women, but no, I don't think so.
Have you, from all of your reading and poking around about what's behind these women, have you picked up any tips? Do you think you could become a grifter?
Oh my goodness, no. And I think that's what drew me so much to her. I'm so the opposite. I'm very reserved and quiet and shy, and like I can't imagine walking into a room and telling a bunch of strangers a bunch of lies about myself. um but I think the confidence is inspiring. The idea that I don't know, it's helpful for someone who is reserved to think like, well, she can go tell people all this crazy stuff. I can walk into a room and speak with confidence. Um, but I could never do what she did.
How many times was she arrested? Does anybody know how many times was she convicted?
She was arrested 3 times that I'm aware of. There are a couple, like 2 or 3 year-long periods in her life to where no one knows where she was or what she was doing. But outside of those times, she was arrested 3 times and convicted twice. Well, so in Toledo, it's interesting. Her first trial, she was acquitted, but she had so many notes that she had forged that they just immediately tried her on another note, and she was convicted of that.
And how much time in total did she spend behind bars?
It was about 5 years, give or take. I think she served around 3 years in Toledo, and then she was paroled. Um, and then in Cleveland, she was convicted in 1905 and she died in 1907. So that was another couple years.
So she was married to Chadwick from the late 1890s until 1905. When did she go to jail while being married, right?
Yes, yeah. She was arrested in 1904 in the winter, and then tried in 1905.
And she is still married to him.
Yeah, I didn't find any evidence of a divorce or anything like that. There was like rumors about it, but I don't think they ever actually did it.
And then she died 2 years later. Did she die because she was sick or old or what happened?
She was only 49 when she died. But so what her death certificate reads neurasthenia. And this was this really, it was a complicated illness back then that doesn't exist anymore. So basically the whole idea about neurasthenia in the Gilded Age, they would say, well, the nervous system is almost like a machine and it runs on nervous energy, and certain things will sap your nervous energy, and will sap your nerves. I mean, it was a lot of nonsense. Some of the things that they would say caused neurasthenia were things like telephone wires, women thinking too much. It's very dated. Um, in reality, neurasthenia was probably a lot of different things that just got broken up into um, different diagnoses, like some more psychological, like depression or anxiety or OCD. Uh, and all that to say, I think it must have been that she was having like a stroke or a heart attack. She was declining in prison, and then she had some instance where she collapsed. And then she was in the prison hospital, and then she died there a few weeks later. It's very vague. So I don't know what the actual cause of death was.
But it's certainly something related to anxiety and the nervous system, I guess, in general.
Yes.
Emotionally disturbing to her, about her, that maybe was contributing to the health side.
Yeah.
Really interesting. So it caught up with her, I guess, is what you're saying.
I don't know.
She was a pretty good actress and she was pretty good at faking it. But at some point, it just kind of came to an end for her.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about it. I, I mean, I know she was losing weight in prison, and so maybe she, yeah, was like kind of depressed and wasn't taking care of herself. Um, it's really just hard to say. She did suffer, like when she was in jail, and like her health just kind of kept deteriorating, basically.
Could you talk a little bit about what was the climate that would allow for this? All seems very loosey-goosey, Annie, to me, that you can offer a promissory note and you can do this, and here's your $50. And by the way, this piece of furniture in my sister's apartment is your. It just seems that would not happen today. So I don't think, or it would happen very much, in the back rooms, and everybody would look back, lawyers would look back at this and say, what were you thinking?
Right.
What was, is it just that it was such a unregulated economy that there was lots of room for people to do? I mean, I do know that from a corporate perspective, it was only in the 1890s that government began to pay more attention and begin to clamp down a little bit. What was going on? Talk a little bit about the Gilded Age and money.
Well, it just seemed a lot more informal to me as I was researching and writing, that there were a lot less checks. I mean, like systematic checks that would prevent something like this from happening. I know for her bigger loans, like in Oberlin, where she basically brought an entire bank down, she just destroyed it. In that case,
You'll have to tell that story in a minute.
The bank president and the bank cashier were breaking laws, so they were acting just illegally. So in that case, the system broke down because they were not following the laws. And in other cases, I mean, she's seeking these kind of informal loans a lot of the time from like private parties. So you can just write up an agreement to be whatever you want it to be. And then, I mean, I think it's just, yeah, these banks are not doing their due diligence when she's presenting them with like a forged Carnegie note as collateral for a loan. They're not, I mean, no one was calling Carnegie. No one, Carnegie had no idea this was happening until 1904, when everything fell apart. Somebody actually finally came to him and said, hey, did you sign these notes? Do you even know this woman? But people just were not doing their due diligence about it. Plus, something that she was doing was offering these really large bonuses. So she would say, okay, loan me $50,000 for a year, and I'll give you an extra $10,000 or $15,000. Just like very absurdly large bonuses that I mean, she was kind of, people were almost taking advantage of her. Someone should have pulled her aside and said, hey, that's way too much money to be offering as a bonus. But it was a trap. She was getting these people by their greed, thinking, oh, she doesn't know what is normal to ask for a bonus. So people thought they were making a lot of money off of these deals, and that's kind of what sucked them in.
Right. And were any of these harmed people, were they coming forward after they'd been tricked by her and reporting her? Is that how did the police get onto her?
So it was one man, Herbert Newton in Boston. She owed him $190,000. And
Wow.
she was not paying, and he had people suing him, and he wasn't able to pay his debts. And so he finally, I mean, it was months of back and forth, and her just keep on delaying and delaying because she really just didn't have any more money at that point. That he finally sued her in Cleveland. And that made the newspapers, which clued off all these other creditors that she was not paying her debts. And that was the end, basically.
Isn't that fascinating? And what happened with the Oberlin Bank situation? Now, you said that the president was acting illegally
Yes.
anyway.
Yes. So what happened, I mean, Charles Beckwith was his name. He was the bank president, and he had a long history of doing a good job and being professional. He'd never committed any kind of fraud or unethical things in his life. Cassie Chadwick came to Oberlin, which was this small college town outside of Cleveland. And she tells him her story. She shows him all this, she's wearing this fine outfit and jewels, and he buys it, and he starts loaning her his own money out of his private fortune. And eventually she just wipes out his fortune because she's just asking for more and more money. And he really believes that he is helping Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, and that she's going to reward his bank with this trust. And eventually what he does is certify bank checks on her behalf, even though she doesn't have any money in the bank. If she wrote a check out for herself, it would bounce. But if the bank president signs it, it's basically putting the bank on the money for paying this check. And so he started doing that along with the bank's cashier. And I believe it was upwards of $247,000.
Wow.
The bank lost and just went under eventually.
Unbelievable. And what happened to him? Do you know?
It's his story is the saddest story of this. He died in 1905 before he could be put on trial. He was arrested and indicted and arrested for conspiracy to misapply the funds of a national bank, which was what he had done. He had been taking the funds of his bank and misapplying it. But he died before he could be prosecuted.
Sounds like he might have died suffering from a bit of anxiety as well.
It was very sad. There were hints in the newspapers that he had maybe been like, he didn't really want to make it. He fell sick and he just kind of had this health collapse, and then he was refusing food, I don't think he wanted to bring this shame on his family of going through this public scandalous trial.
Yeah, right. We think of snobby communities as Newport, of course, in New York. Cleveland has its Millionaires Row. Shaker Heights is not a bad, shabby place to come from. I mean, there's some really, and I think that we often think of this is a New Englander's prejudice, and I admit it, that we don't know and think about the incredible wealth that existed in the Midwest. And I think it was Cleveland where there are more Fortune 500 companies than anywhere else in America at some point. I think it was Cleveland. Anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's a very rich community. Yeah. It was a very rich community at that time.
Yes.
And I suspect that Toledo must have been. Tell us a little bit about Ohio during the Gilded Age, and maybe touch on Millionaires Row and high society in Cleveland, and we'll see if there are any similarities between Cleveland and Newport.
Well, Ohio in general, a lot of the Midwest, it's similar to like Pittsburgh and some of these other cities. Between railroads, there was just so much wealth. There were all these iron and steel plants. There were railroads could take people places between cities. They could bring a lot of workers over really quickly. A lot of immigrants coming into the country and going to Cleveland because there's a new steel mill and there's a new iron plant or whatever. And so just a lot of growth, a lot of new money at this time period, a lot of it. And similar for all these little Midwestern cities like Toledo and Chicago and uh like St. Louis and stuff like that. But Cleveland just hugely so because you had so much iron and steel being processed around Lake Erie. And so you have all these new iron and steel magnates and railroad magnates, and many of them in Cleveland decided to build their houses on Euclid Avenue, which they referred to as Millionaire's Row, because it was just this beautiful wide street lined with elm trees on either side and these beautiful mansions just keep going down and just they got bigger and better. John D. Rockefeller built his mansion on Euclid Avenue, and it was actually one of the more tame ones. If you look at pictures, and you could find all these pictures online with all these mansions on them, and his was it was a mansion, but it was pretty chill compared to some of the other ones. Sylvester Everett had this castle. It just looks like a castle. It was beautiful. The Andrews house was just actually it was notorious because he built this house and he wanted to be the finest house on Euclid Avenue or possibly anywhere, and they couldn't maintain it. They ended up not living in it very long because they couldn't provide enough staff to actually maintain this house. But it was beautiful.
And are many of those houses still along Euclid?
No. I want to say there are one or two. I think the Drury House is still on Euclid, but that wasn't built until after the Gilded Age. It was like 1930s. And then I think one of the Chisholm mansions, because there are a couple different mansions from the Chisholm family. I think one of them is still around.
Oh, what a shame.
I know.
So these were houses that were built and didn't really exist for more than 20 or 30 or, well, I don't know when they were when they were abandoned, but in Newport, the income tax certainly began to sour people, make people much more skeptical. World War I and World War II changed society completely. And we have a book called Lost Newport. And I think it's 59 houses, the size of the Elms and Marble House, which are huge mansions,
Right.
existed in the neighborhood where I'm sitting right now, and all gone. So it's hard to imagine 59 additional houses. We think what we have now is robust, but you add those others and it really was just unbelievable, all gone. I mean, it just breaks your heart to think how different it would have been if those houses were still here today.
Oh man, I know. I thought so much about like being able to tour the Everett house would have been so amazing.
Right. Yeah. Now, Cassie at one point became a smuggler. See, she had all of these different dimensions and careers. What was that all about?
So after she married Leroy Chadwick, something that was very common for wealthy people at that point to do was to travel in Europe, to summer in Europe, to go over there for a month or two in the summer. And so that was something that they did as a family. And I think duties for jewelry at the time, when you brought jewelry back into the country, if you bought it in like France or Belgium, you'd have to pay 10% to customs agents, to the federal government. And Cassie did not want to do that. So she would conceal and hide these jewels because she bought a lot of jewelry, a lot of diamonds in Belgium, a lot in Paris. And she would lie and conceal the jewels when she came back into the country. And it was just on a pretty large scale basis. And it started attracting the federal government's attention.
And so did she get arrested or convicted for her smuggling activities?
And no, so it kind of all came to a head in 1902. A friend or acquaintance, someone anonymous, kind of called the customs people and said, hey, she has this ruby necklace that she smuggled into the country. She didn't pay any duties on it. And so a customs agent named William Theobald, he had kind of been on her case for a little while, and at that point she's staying at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York, and he pounds on her door and he says, "You have to turn over this necklace. I know you smuggled it." And I mean, she argues with him for a while. She's aware of her rights and that he needs a warrant, but she eventually turns it in, and then she immediately starts fighting to get it back. So she lawyers up, and she gets a bunch of her friends from back in Cleveland to write all these letters in her support. And, saying that she's an honest person, she has integrity, and she has had this necklace for years or whatever. And one of those people was Marcus Hanna. And he was a big name at the time because he was a huge name nationally in the Republican Party. He was known as the Kingmaker because he would make people's careers. He kind of handpicked and supported President McKinley in his bid for the presidency. So Cassie kind of knew Marcus Hanna, and he wrote this letter to the customs people that said, Cassie Chadwick, she has all this integrity. She doesn't lie. I saw these jewels in the necklace on her before, so obviously she didn't smuggle them. And so they returned the necklace, and she won.
Wow. I think we have about 1.5 minutes.
Oh.
Very quickly. Carnegie. Tell us about Cassie and Carnegie.
Carnegie had no idea this was happening until 1904, when everything blew up. He was very embarrassed and frustrated because for a long time, people still believed it. She had done a good job, and people were still thinking that he was her father after he had denied it publicly.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. He was not happy about it.
And why did she choose that name? Just because why not?
I think it was a calculated gamble that he was known for his generosity at the time. And so, people would think, of course, Carnegie, he's giving away all these libraries. Of course, if he had an illegitimate daughter, he would support her and give her all this money.
Wow. Very, very clever woman. This is a fantastic story that you have uncovered and unveiled. I really hope your book goes well. How's it doing so far?
Hopefully, well, I really don't know. I don't like to check things too much. I don't like to get in my head about it.
Well, I am going to read it because it's a really fantastic story. And I don't know if I like Cassie or not, but I certainly am intrigued by her. And I suspect that that's what lured you in.
Yes.
She's got a style about her that you have to be fascinated with. But thank you. I really appreciate your help and your telling us this wonderful story today, Annie. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.